Right, so hello everybody. My name is Peter Coe. I'm a member of the School of Law at the University of Reading, and I'm also an Associate Research Fellow here at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies and the Information Law Policy Centre. And I'm also the author of Media Freedom in the Age of Citizen Journalism, which was published in December by Edward Elgar. So before I begin with my little bit, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. I'm joined today by Paul Wragg and Rebecca Mousavian from the University of Leeds, David Rolfe from the University of Sydney, Lexi Kokon-Kawana from Impress, and András Koltai from the Hungarian Communication and Media Authority. I want to thank Paul, Rebecca, David, András and Lexi for not only agreeing to read my book and then take part in this panel, when I know they're all very, very busy, but also for the support they've given me throughout my career and also whilst I was writing this book. Each one of them has played a huge part in getting the book to this point. They're all brilliant and inspirational lawyers and also lovely people. And because of that, I owe them a huge debt of gratitude. I also owe them all a drink, which is probably a really good thing, but this is a virtual book launch because it means I get away with not actually having to buy them one. I also want to thank Nora and Daly and the team at the ILPC and IALS for hosting this event. And as always, their support has been, so incredibly helpful. So thank you to them. And last, but by no means least, I want to thank you all. Having a real book in my hand and one that I've actually written still seems rather surreal. And I think it's going to take me a while to get used to that. Thanks, Paul. There you go. Paul's got it. He's plugging it already. What will take me even longer to get used to, though, is that people such as yourselves are interested in it, or at least you're pretending to be interested in it, and what I have to say, and that you may even read it. So thank you all very much for being here. It really does mean an awful lot to me. So I'm going to kick things off this morning by giving you an overview of my book. And specifically, I'll explain what motivated me to write it and why I'm so fascinated by the press and by citizen journalism. And also I'll give you an overview of the main claims that I make in the book. However, I will swiftly hand over to Paul, Rebecca, András, David and Lexi, who have each agreed to give their views on particular aspects of the book and or issues that the book raises. And then there'll be time at the end for you all to ask questions of the panel if you have any. So, why write this book then? What was the motivation behind it? Well, as I say in the introduction to the book, journalism has changed. The internet and social media have permanently altered the media ecology and have shifted the media paradigm beyond recognition by enabling new actors in the form of independent publishers and citizen journalists to enter the media marketplace, and by changing the way and the speed in which that news is generated, published, and consumed. On the one hand, these changes have had a profound effect on the viability of the traditional institutional press and on the extent to which journalists operating within the industry's typical corporate institutional structure are able to discharge their watchdog role and contribute positively to public discourse and the public sphere. The internet and social media have contributed to the pressures that are generated by corporate ownership of the institutional press. And arguably, and this is something I talk about in a lot of detail in the book, these pressures encourage journalists operating within this structure to publish content that appeals to mass audiences and attracts advertisers rather than to engage in high quality yet expensive and time consuming diverse public interest journalism. It's certainly not the case, of course, with all, but that seems to be a problem that is happening throughout the industry. On the other hand, however, the internet and social media do not only remove the technological and financial barriers to producing and disseminating content by allowing anybody with internet access to communicate instantaneously with a mass audience, they also enable journalists to circumvent the structure and some of the norms of the institutional press. And in a sense, they liberate those journalists from some of the constraints and the pressures imposed on the press by the dominant proprietor and corporate ownership models. Consequently, there's an argument to be had that the internet's dismantling of these obstacles has contributed to the democratization of the public sphere by making the emergence of more voices in the public space possible. And this is a contention that is animated by the ascendance of citizen journalism. Indeed, it's a central claim in my book that citizen journalists are no longer an outlier of free speech. Rather, they're central to how we communicate and how we receive information and ideas. It's this change in the media ecosystem and the shift that this has caused in our media paradigm and what this means for our understanding of free speech, press freedom and regulation, and for laws relating to, for instance, defamation, privacy, contempt of court, and how we manage online anonymity and pseudonymity, which really fascinates me. And this really is the core motivation for my book and my ongoing research. So before I discuss with you what, in my view, this all means and one of the main claims in my book, I want to explain briefly what I mean by citizen journalism and why citizen journalists are, I think, so important and why they warranted me doing the research in the first place to produce this book. So the first thing to say about citizen journalism is that it isn't new. In fact, its origins can be found in the 1980s and probably even further back than that. But it was the internet and the emergence of social media in particular that really provided the means for journalism to be opened up to citizens. Because of the wide spectrum of activity that it covers, citizen journalism is not easy to define. If you read books on this, which I have done, I've read lots of them, there are various different definitions, various different ways of describing a citizen journalist. But I think I managed to kind of distill all of that into the following. So at one end, and its most primal and crudest, it could be an individual providing some sort of one-off content on an event that contributes to public discourse. However, for some of these bloggers, this can trigger and has triggered at the beginning of a journey in which their journalistic activity becomes increasingly professionalized and important to the public sphere. So at the opposing end of the spectrum, at its most sophisticated, citizen journalism can include actors operating outside of the institutional media structure, really as professional journalists in all but name. And it can arguably even encapsulate professional journalists blogging in an individual capacity, rather than as part of the institutional press and broadcast media. And in fact, something I discuss again in detail in the book is how job cuts in the press industry have led to a growth of independent journalists who then compete with their former employers, which can in turn further undermine the financial viability of some members of the press. Now, citizen journalists at this end of the spectrum contribute to the robustness of the public sphere in a myriad of different and impactful ways from countries all over the world. For instance, the blog Nightjack, which I discuss in detail in the book in the context of the author of the blog and Times Newspapers Limited litigation, won the 2009 Orwell Blogger Prize. The blog's author, Richard Horton, was a serving police officer who used it to pseudonymously discuss his work and criticise government ministers and police operations. Now, according to judges who awarded the prize to Nightjack, the blog's whistleblowing content provided a valuable insight into everyday life of the police, which took the audience to the heart of what a police officer does. The content produced by the political blog Guido Fawkes, which is authored by Paul Staines, has also been the subject of significant critical acclaim, and the blog's extensive reach was the subject of evidence presented to Lord Justice Leveson during his inquiry into the culture, practices, and ethics of the press. But arguably, however, the positive impact of citizen journalism on the public sphere is most obvious in conflict or crisis situations that present significant dangers or accessibility challenges to members of the institutional press. In these situations, citizen journalists provide real-time, on-the-ground coverage of events as they unfold. from areas that are often inaccessible to professional reporters. They have not only provided alternative content to what the mainstream media is able to publish or broadcast, but perhaps more importantly, they have covered events that would have been or have been missed entirely by institutional media outlets. And we saw this during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are unfortunately seeing it again now in the conflict in Ukraine. So that's really an overview of why I think citizen journalism is so important. Again, I go into much more detail in the book. And what I'm going to talk about briefly now is the book's structure, just to give you a sense of that. And I'm going to talk about the book's key claims. So to give you an idea of how the book's structured, it's divided into three parts. The media landscape is the first part. Then I move on to looking at theoretical considerations and then legal challenges and how the theory that I advocate in the book can perhaps help with some of the legal challenges we're facing at the moment. Now, I make a number of claims in each of these three sections. But of time, and as I've said, we really want to hear from the panelists, not from me. And because of the importance of citizen journalism, I'm going to give you an overview of the book's key theoretical claim. So I make the claim, and this certainly isn't a claim that's just made by me. I should add that this is a claim that's been made by lots of other people before me. I make the claim that the enhanced right to media freedom attaches to actors defined as media, and that this right is a freedom which serves specific positive goals for democratic participation. Therefore, it affords media entities privilege protection over and above non-media. But as a result, it carries with it concomitant responsibilities and obligations. So consequently, I argue, and again, this is not something that I just argue, but there are two categories of free speech: the personal right to freedom of expression, and secondly, media freedom. And that free speech ought to be treated differently to media freedom. So that's the first kind of claim I make in respect of the theoretical considerations. Now, in a world where citizen journalists are making an important contribution to the public sphere by reporting on matters of public interest, being able to identify the beneficiaries of media freedom is critical to the effective operation of the right. However, in the current categorization of who belongs to which group, there's a gap or confusion, as there's a definable category of actors who are, as citizen journalists, effectively media, but are not always recognized as such. And this is because the methods that have traditionally been used to define media, and therefore who should be subject to the enhanced right to media freedom, at best, I argue, lack merit and are at worst redundant. Because of the vital role being played by citizen journalists in the news gathering process and in the publication of public interest news, both as publishers in their own right and as sources of news used by the institutional media, this situation is problematic. Now, this difficult situation we find ourselves in with citizen journalists is understandable. The dominant philosophical theories that underpin free speech and media freedom, in particular, John Stuart Mill's argument from truth, and particularly in the context of online expression, the marketplace of ideas. But these libertarian arguments are based on 19th and early 20th century means of communication. They're not, in my view, necessarily suitable for 21st century speech in the modern media, of which, as I've said, the internet, social media, and citizen journalism are now central components. As it stands, the law relating to the operation of free speech and media freedom is lagging behind reality. Consequently, the law's treatment of media freedom as a normative concept needs to be modernized. But for the law to catch up, so must its theoretical foundations. So what my book does is it offers an alternative framework that deals with these problems and understands media freedom within the context of 21st century means of communication, and also the legal challenges that this creates. And I hope, if it were adopted, would ultimately improve access to the public sphere. So to facilitate this modernisation, I advance a new functional definition of media that distinguishes media from non-media actors. And I call this the media as a constitutional component concept. And could I just say something here? If any of you are ever thinking about writing a book or doing a PhD or coming up with a theory, please don't do what I did. Think of something a lot more snappy than the media as a constitutional component concept, because I have to say this a lot at the moment and it's becoming increasingly annoying. Just a one word concept would be much better. So you can learn from my mistakes. So this concept, the media as a constitutional component concept, there you go, it's the second time I've had to say it, is underpinned by social responsibility theory and the argument from democratic self-governance. Yeah, MAC for short, Rebecca, that's absolutely right. I'm going to call it MAC. I argue that although the conditions created by the internet has meant that libertarianism has become the dominant normative paradigm for online speech, in reality, social responsibility theory provides a more appropriate foundation for the modern media. Essentially, the theories differ in that libertarianism dictates that free speech is absolute, and as a result doesn't propagate duties and responsibilities that attach to the right to freedom of expression and media freedom. Whereas under social responsibility theory, this freedom carries concomitant responsibilities and obligations to society, employers, and the expression marketplace. And this normative foundation provided by the social responsibility theory supports its premise that adherence to certain norms of public discourse, so in other words, the type of speech conveyed by the actor, and standards of professional behaviour. So, for example, acting ethically and in good faith, and in publishing content that's based on appropriate research to verify the provenance of it and its sources, rather than the education, training, or employment of the actor, should define who is a journalist. And in turn, this functional rather than institutional approach to defining media determines who should benefit from the enhanced right to media freedom and be subject to its duties and responsibilities. So in a nutshell, the definition is as follows: a natural and legal person engaged in the process of gathering information of public concern, interest, and significance, with the intention and for the purpose of disseminating this information to a section of the public, whilst complying with objective standards governing the research, news gathering, and editorial process. And these standards would include, for instance, the time spent researching stories and ensuring the provenance and reliability of information. So the concepts, norms of discourse, and standards of behaviour create a threshold. Actors operating within this are classed as media and are therefore entitled to the benefits that come with being defined as such, whilst those operating outside of it are not afforded the same status and the protection that comes with it, albeit, of course, they're still subject to the general right to freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention. So, just to conclude, in a nutshell, I suggest that in the final part of the book, this conceptual framework could help to deal with a number of legal challenges. So, for instance, I suggest that it could improve the credibility of anonymous and pseudonymous speech through its harmonisation of speaker and audience interests. It could help to maintain fair trials whilst allowing citizen journalists to access court documents and legal proceedings. It could better promote and protect media freedom in the context of the law of defamation, and it could provide a conceptual rationale that could underpin a modified regulatory scheme. I don't have time to go into all of this now. You'll need to read the book for that. Or, of course, you can listen to what our panel has to say. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to them. I think, Paul, I think you're up first. If that's okay. I'll stop talking now. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over to Paul.
Thank you, Pete. So I'm Paul Ragg, Professor of Media Law at the University of Leeds. I have known Pete, I've known and loved Pete since I met him in 2013. I was his PhD supervisor. And so have seen this book develop from an idea to its full form. So I'm going to speak for 10 minutes, and I'm going to speak as a commentator, but also speak as a former supervisor who's incredibly proud of Pete and how far he has come. and the success that he has had. The idea for this book, as Pete has said, centres around this idea of the media as a constitutional component. Pete and I have had many a discussion about this idea. We're both fascinated with press regulation and how press regulation can be achieved in a way that preserves press freedom, but also the interests that victims have in a functional regulatory system, and the interests that society as a whole has in the media performing its function as a fourth estate. Now, it's this last idea on which I think Pete and I depart from each other. And when I first came into academia, I remember looking at professors who had these PhD students and getting a sense that many of their PhD students were acolytes that simply just followed exactly what the supervisor said and essentially was just acting as a promoter of their work. And I always thought there was something deeply wrong about that, whilst at the same time admiring the fact that these professors were able to attract acolytes. And so in my role as a PhD supervisor, I've achieved one of these goals in that Pete has departed almost from everything that I've said to him and seems to agree with nothing. I think this is a success, although it may say something damning about the quality of my own work. The reason why I admire Pete's book, and I think it's a fantastic piece of research, is the fact that he is trying to breathe new life into an old idea that we find in the Hutchins Commission of the late 40s, and similar ideas that we find in the first public inquiry into the state of the press in the UK. And this is this idea of the press having a duty to act as a public watchdog. The social responsibility theory, which Pete has mentioned, underpins the idea that the media has this constitutional component. I want to agree with Pete, I have to say. I want to believe that the press has this function and that citizen journalists need to step into the shoes of the institutional press and actually acts in a way that the institutional press is not acting at the present time by holding government to account. What we've seen over the past 10 years has been a decline in the quality of the institutional press's willingness, I won't say ability, but willingness to act independently of government. I think it's important that the press is not shackled with ideas of impartiality and such things. But it's also important that someone is able to hold government to account. In fact, we've seen this in relation to Partygate. Partygate has taken on a life of its own. It's now become Beergate. But there's two elements to Partygate and Beergate that you won't find in newspapers. One of which is that journalists themselves were invited to at least some of these parties, and we know that there were journalists attending these parties. Now, that of itself may explain why there was such a delay in reporting these events. Why has it taken us this long to find out that these parties were happening in 2020? The other element, of course, as well, is we see certain sections of the press, certainly the right-wing press, pushing an agenda that suits the current government. This idea of Beergate, for example. The Daily Mail is falling over itself to tell us on the one hand that Partygate is a waste of our time, that no one cares about it, that we should all move on, that there's a war on, whilst on the other hand, at the moment, they are counting the number of days on their front page that Beergate has been going on. Now, citizen journalism is the antidote, it seems, to this. There are sources of information that provide quality journalism, and many of which are regulated by Impress, which of course Pete is part of, as I am too. So Pete's ideas are incredibly important to the present context that we find ourselves in. And what Pete does in the book is to set out not only why this is intellectually satisfying, why this idea is coherent, but also, and importantly, adds a practical value to this idea. Towards the end of the book, Pete sets out what he thinks are important components for a regulatory system to adopt in a way that would bring in citizen journalists and those that we don't automatically think of as being part of the press. One of the challenges, of course, for citizen journalists is actually getting their information to the audience, because presently they have to go through gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers are typically internet providers, Twitter being the obvious one, but not only Twitter, other sources of social media. And that's why it's so great, I think, that we're joined today by Andres Colte, because after Pete's book, I think one of the most important books to hit the shelves in recent times has been Andres's book on social media as gatekeepers. That's not the title of the book, but I've forgotten what it's actually called. But Andres will tell us. The other thing that Pete does, I think, incredibly well in the book, and which has been prescient, is to think about how citizen journalists are affected by the threat of defamation. And in this sense, Pete clearly anticipates, as if he had a crystal ball, the slaps concern that is animating government's policy at the moment. Government is intent on doing something about slaps. And it's through his expertise that, rightly, he has been recognised by this government as an authority on this point, has been invited to Parliament only yesterday, in fact, to brief a select committee on the problem of slaps. Now, it's not often that this government actually listens to experts. As we know, they're not that keen on experts. But actually, it's incredibly important for all of us here that Pete is part of this process, because we need him to speak sensibly to the problem, to recognise that citizen journalism is important, but at the same time, so are the rights of individuals. Towards the end of the book, he talks about defamation and its threat. And this is why we are incredibly fortunate to have David Rolfe with us, who I am going to call the leading authority on defamation in the world, because he is, in fact, the leading authority on defamation in the world. For those that know David, you can talk to him about any aspect of defamation. He knows far more about this subject than anyone. His recall of facts and cases is immense. But I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca Mousavian. One of the aspects of Pete's book that I have written about myself, which is privacy. A lot of the regulatory framework that we have in place is animated by concerns about privacy. And Rebecca joins us again, I think as the leading authority on privacy, particularly in the context of images, Rebecca is my colleague at Leeds, and this has been brilliant for me, but also terrible for my career, because no one asks me privacy questions anymore. They just turn to Rebecca. So, Rebecca, I'm passing over to you.
Thanks, Paul. A bit generous, but cheers. And also thanks to Pete for including me in this panel. And I'd sort of like to congratulate you really on the publication of Media Freedom and the Age of Citizen Journalism. Writing a monograph is an achievement, I think, at the best of times, let alone during a pandemic, while juggling, homeschooling and stressed students and things. So it's obviously work that's very much paid off. For anyone who hasn't yet sort of read the book, Pete obviously outlined the sort of thesis earlier on. It sort of puts forward I think, a very convincing case for a sort of special media-free expression that is distinct from individual free expression, whilst also rejecting the kind of the libertarian or absolutist approach that prevails in the US. But as well as bringing, special sort of benefits and protections, Peter's sort of thesis or model also brings with it responsibilities and obligations if parties are to qualify for those benefits. And for the purposes of qualifying for these special media freedoms and protections, Peter focuses on the functions of actors rather than the institutions per se. And this is a really sort of flexible approach that enables crucial new forms of media, especially citizen journalism, as we've mentioned, to potentially benefit from those crucial protections. And so that's the part of the book I've found, particularly interesting. I really enjoyed reading this. It really is a great book, and obviously I'm relieved to be able to say that, but also happy to be able to say that it's so carefully researched, it's clearly and engagingly written, nicely paced, and these things aren't always, I find, a given with academics or lawyers. And it covers a really rich range of topical issues, obviously, such as things like fake news, the challenges of, regulating hugely powerful modern platforms, the shift from old media to new media, to name but a few issues. But I think in particular, and like Paul, it doesn't necessarily fit hand in glove with my own views. So Paul and Peter have different positions on many of these issues. My position is probably characterized by ambivalence, if anything, or general skepticism. But in particular, I think Pete's book nonetheless represents an admirable attempt to deal with some of the most pressing media and free expression problems, of our time. And this is no mean feat. And obviously no single book can provide a complete panacea to the global challenges that are posed by old and new media alike. Nonetheless, what it does do is it advocates a model, the media as constitutional component, or we'll call the MAC model now. And what I feel as I read this is it's really underpinned by integrity, possibly in a Dworkinian sense as well, by modern liberal values that can kind of guide policy and can guide adjudication in this area in a positive sense. And in this sense, I think it does have the sort of the real potential, the capacity to make positive real world practical impact, though I suspect that it will have a slightly warmer reception from judges on the bench than it will have from Nadine Dorries, for example. Although, as Paul's just revealed, Parliament is clearly interested as well and will benefit from Pete's insights, and I think that's great. So as I read through the book, there were sort of 3 or 4 issues that I think raised particular interest or spoke to me. And so I'm going to sort of outline those issues and just sort of my thoughts on those issues, really. And I'd be interested to hear, Pete, your views on those. The first sort of question or issue that interested me is the perennial problem of public interest speech. So Peter puts forward, a thoughtful, a nuanced approach to determining public interest speech. It recognises public interest as a spectrum rather than a dichotomy. A sort of not a black and white issue, but one with sort of shades of grey, we might say. And, I would say that this is an improvement on, for example, approaches in misuse of private information case law. These have sometimes adopted this kind of binary opposition between sort of lofty, noble, objective reportage on matters of sort of, high politics on the one hand, and sort of tabloid tittle-tattle and unseemly gossip on the other. But ultimately, I think for Peter and for all of us, in fact, public interest and non-public interest speech ultimately do lie at either end of that spectrum. So we still have a division of sorts, one that's perhaps difficult to sort of escape or think outside of. And I still think that distinguishing between public interest and non-public interest speech, might be tricky. Now, maybe at the edges of the spectrum, it's fairly straightforward. So, reporting on, a Watergate scandal, for example, or, sort of discussing or talking about a frock someone wore to an event, for example, might arguably fall quite squarely at either side of that spectrum. But what about more borderline or mixed examples that might be more difficult to categorize? So again, just to consider some examples, what about the blogger who writes about consumer affairs? For example, testing beauty products and, to check their claims or to let others know how they work. Now, I've chosen their gendered and frivolous example on purpose. Is that a public interest speech? Or, an influencer, for example, who vlogs about a range of matters, including his own mental health issues. Is that expression with a public interest value? Or, I don't know, a TikTok star who creates, dance routines to get children interested in exercise or activity. Or even to take an example from the 1990s, one that I always had a grudging sort of fondness for, the fake shake exposés of the 1990s that the tabloids undertook, which had behind some of them anyway, important exposés or exposing certain types of behaviour, whilst at the other sort of a slightly farcical comic angle. So the question I suppose I would have is, are these public interest expressions? Where do they fit on the spectrum? Another sort of issue or question that also I think is really interesting, again, perhaps fits with this and with some of my earlier work, is the social responsibility thesis that Peter draws upon and indeed updates. And in particular, the model of the human or the individual that this social responsibility thesis kind of assumes or is constructed upon. So Pete's media as constitutional component, draws upon this model, as I've said, and it draws upon it to set out requirements that the media actors should meet in order to sort of benefit from specific freedoms and protections, and that includes general qualities like not by all reasonable qualities and admirable qualities, a commitment to truth, and for example, and to an extent neutrality, commitment to discussion. Pete claims that the underlying view of people under this social responsibility model is more realistic, he says, and less idealistic than the I suppose the assumptions adopted by those absolutist models. For example, the marketplace of ideas justification, which is a model that assumes people are perhaps rational and always informed and can easily discern different types of information. Now, I've got a lot of sympathy for this view, for Pete's view, as Pete claims there are certain benefits of the social responsibility thesis and the realistic, sort of fallible humans that model assumes, because we are, I suppose, all, we fit all those qualities and all of those properties, both idealistic and indeed fallible. But I suppose that I also find the counterclaim of critics of this sort of model quite, I suppose, quite cogent. And that is, does this view of humans not risk sort of underestimating people's abilities, and in the noble attempt to try and protect people from sort of this kind of information, do we not end up infantilizing them or indeed underestimating them? So that's another sort of question that I put to Peter. I had a couple of other issues, but I think for reasons of time, I'll just finish off with one final issue or question that I found of interest. And I think, again, it's sort of been touched upon already. And that is how the media is constitutional component. You've got this lovely sort of living model that Peter's kind of, constructed. How might that deal with, or engage with media law or media kind of events that are happening right now as we speak? So for example, the obvious one, and one that Peter has just touched upon, is the essential role of citizen journalism in bringing ground level events in the Ukraine war to global attention. How, what can the MAC model offer this particular sort of phenomenon? And what about, again, Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and his stated wish to use it or ensure that it's a space for free expression? Just this morning, the news reported that he argued the removal of Donald Trump, or the permanent removal of Donald Trump from Twitter, was problematic because it created kind of a pariah sort of victimhood status on the right that benefits the right, which we might view skeptically otherwise. The government's selling off of Channel 4 and its general hostility to the BBC. And we could add also to the mix, because it's happening right now, the current Agatha Christie defamation trial between Colleen Rooney and Rebecca Vardy. So these are all things that are happening right now. And again, I just wondered if, when we come back to Peter, whether he has any thoughts about how his thesis fits with some of those events. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. There's a number of things there. I'll come back on it later at the end when we take questions. But I'm going to hand over to Andras now, if that's okay with you, Andras.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Pete, congratulations to this fascinating book. I had the chance to read it already in manuscript form, but it's always different to hold it in your hands as a proper book, and it's really a great achievement, and I'm really happy with that, because in the last couple of years, quite a few books were published on the theoretical issues of press freedom and journalists' freedom, and I think it's a very important addition to this debate. And thank you very much for including me in this panel. I also had the chance to write a review about this book. Hopefully, it will be published in the Journal of Media Law in the near future, and I would like to make a few suggestions also included in my review on some points that may prompt further reflection by you and by any readers of this great book. My first point is that the existence of obligations on the media deriving from the right to media freedom and of obligations that may be imposed in return for such a right is questionable, as Paul already referred to this problem. Although the theory of social responsibility, many court and in Europe constitutional court judgments, as well as extensive Strasbourg case law refer to the media's obligations, it is really difficult to identify concrete and generally applicable examples of such obligations in various legal systems. The theory of social responsibility does not argue that all media products must serve the public interest, but instead by proposing the division of media freedom, and that's what Pete did in the book, it would afford privileges to those who undertake to participate in the distribution of information on current affairs. Current affairs content of public interest is indeed given greater protection by the courts, but this stems from the nature of the content and not from the identity of the speaker, as you also highlighted in the book. That is, the media have no additional rights over other speakers, whether they be citizen journalists or just people on the street or average Facebook users, just as they have no additional obligations either. Moreover, this extra protection, for example, in defamation or privacy cases, is already available to all speakers, not just the legacy media or professional journalists. The only example of media having special obligations is the right of reply rule enforced in almost all European jurisdictions. UK is an exception, as usual. That is applicable for all types of media. The situation is different for the regulation of media services, mainly broadcasting, due impartiality rule, the quota rules, special rules for covering local issues, so on and so forth. But we cannot recognize any general duty that is applicable to all types of media. In order to avoid legal liability, the conduct, good faith, and diligence of a media outlet can be investigated by a law enforcement body, for example, in cases related to the protection of personality rights, defamation, and privacy again. The checklist of the 10 items put forward in the well-known Reynolds decision is a good example for that. Also, journalist ethical standards, which are laid down in self-regulatory codes or ethical regulations, can also indirectly infiltrate the decisions of the courts. However, due diligence cannot be considered an obligation on the media outlet, even if it may lead to exemption from liability. I think that is an important point. And my second point is that bringing public discourse to the fore and maintaining full support for media freedom for those media outlets only which seek to participate in this public discourse creates a controversial situation. If media freedom can be exercised with full force in relation to current affairs content only, it means that the legal system is making a distinction between what the public is interested in and what is important in inverted commas. In other words, media freedom helps the media to deliver what the public needs to know, not merely what it wants to know. The framework for public discourse is certainly broader than political speech or speech directly related to democratic procedures. It would be difficult to reach a consensus on what exactly belongs to public discourse, more precisely to identify where its boundaries lie, whether the tabloids fit in, or if the category of public figure should only be reserved for politics in general. Or do we leave it to the media themselves to decide what the public needs to be informed about? If we define the scope of public matters according to what the media says newsworthy, we will be trapped. The media will consider themselves the most appropriate decision makers, so they can identify the scope of public matters with the issues it considers important, which could have adverse consequences for the quality and range of its provision of information and for the protection of privacy, for example. In principle, of course, a solution which diverges from the current one is conceivable, even one that imposes a real duty on the media to present public issues if they wish to benefit from the full blessings of media freedom. In such a paradigm, media that do not undertake to do so will not enjoy a higher level of protection of media freedom than freedom of expression in general. That is what you are arguing in the book, actually. However, it seems to be a dangerous terrain. Although further content regulation of the media should be avoided, and I assume we can all agree on that point, the mere fact that courts must distinguish between current affairs and other types of content would constitute indirect content regulation. European legal systems provide the media with a number of privileges, of which Pete describes in detail those known to the UK legal system. Certain rules, such as the provision for the protection of sources of information, are already worded in general terms, protecting not only the media, but also anyone who reaches out to the public and makes their views known. This is not an unjustified approach, as not only the media, but also any individual speaker can provide information to the public. However, many rules granting privileges and established in other European legal systems refer specifically to media or journalists, media meaning professional or legacy media. Legal systems generally have not yet narrowed down the definition of journalists, as Pete suggests in his book. So the exercise of additional rights is partly granted to a wider and partly to a narrower circle. All traditional media can enjoy these privileges, but other members of the public cannot exercise them. My third point is that there are good reasons for this narrowing, that is, for ensuring the exclusivity of the privileges to professional and traditional media. If the privileges were granted to any member of the public, any citizen journalist, so to say, these rights could easily be abused, making it harder to detect crime, for example, by applying the protection of sources or the protection against searches and seizure, or cluttering up courtrooms and press conferences if social media users generally who want to report on public affairs could also be admitted. If anyone, potentially any member of the public, could invoke these rights, then the nature of these privileges would be transformed and they would become generally available rights. There are a number of obstacles to this, partly natural and partly obstacles aimed at protecting the public interest, to ensure law enforcement or the possibility of enforcing rights under private law, or to guarantee the functioning of public institutions, courts, prisons, so on and so forth. Finally, just a few words related to Pete's proposed regulatory solution. This is a strongly incentivized but not universally mandatory regulation of the press. I think this is the solution that might indeed be worth trying at one point. And I like the idea. I think the structure you arguing for is really looks really great. Another issue is whether it ever will have a chance to really become as a new foundation of press regulation. Traces of such an approach can already be found in some European countries. We can cite the Irish regulation, the Finnish regulation. There are some traces all around Europe, which is in line with Pete's ideas. However, the use of co-regulation for the issues that the author is examining is not common and definitely not general in Europe. Some authors, and I assume Paul Ragg will agree with me on this point, concludes that only a regulatory solution that is independent of publishers in terms of its staffing and funding, that can impose meaningful sanctions on publishers that are binding upon them based on law, can be truly independent and effective, and that this can only be achieved by either mandatory regulation or maybe co-regulatory systems existing under the close supervision of a certain state authority. My book, Paul kindly mentioned, deals with the issue how major online gatekeepers transformed the traditional notion of media, mainly the element of or the criteria of editorial activity and editorial responsibility. And I looked up on the internet, and its title is New Media and Freedom of Expression, published by Hart 3 years ago. So I dealt with similar issues as Pete's book, but from the perspective of the major online gatekeepers. So I'm really glad that Pete worked out the principles related to traditional media and the press. Altogether, and just to wrap up my short speech, Pete's book is a valuable contribution to an important and evergreen topic. It does not fall into the trap of fundamentally questioning the validity and relevance of previous legal doctrines, rules, and practices just because the advent of new technologies. With subtle empathy, he seeks to combine the centuries-old constitutional tradition of media freedom with a sweeping paradigm shift of the public sphere that has become part of our everyday life. And thanks for that. And congratulations again to your book. I'm looking forward to your comments on my points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andras. I really appreciate that. I think we've got David next.
Excellent. Oh, well, thank you. Thanks, Pete, for having me. And I should probably say just in advance, if the internet connection is unstable, it's because I'm at my sister's holiday house. So hopefully I won't drop out or anything like that. But I did bring a copy of the book, which is great. It's great to have it in hard copy. And the cover is excellent, which obviously is one of the most important things. But the content, of course, is equally excellent. I want to talk broadly about three things. One is to engage with the central idea of this media as a constitutional component. And then I want to talk specifically about applying that to contempt and defamation, which, as Peter has said, he does towards the end of the book. And so it was interesting hearing Paul talk about some reservations about the concept of MAC. And I don't want to be too parochial or too cynical, but we're in the middle of a federal election campaign here. And it's 6 weeks long, and we're only 4 weeks in. And one of the central sort of issues which has emerged is real criticism of media reporting. If you actually read tabloid newspapers or even broadsheet newspapers, or if you listen to watch commercial television or radio, the sorts of issues that everyone is talking about are not sort of really reflected. So, of course, in Australia, you have, as you do in most economies around the world, problems with inflation, cost of living, petrol prices, and there are all sorts of international reasons for that, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine being sort of central to those. But we have, newspapers and television broadcasts putting front page stories about stopping boat people coming to Australia, which was an issue politicised in 2010 and 2013, but I haven't been able to leave my country for 3 years. So the idea that this is one of the most pressing issues is sort of surreal. And so I think one of the things that I was thinking about, and Paul sort of picked up on this, talking about Partygate and Beergate, and I think there's a sort of tension or an ambivalence here, or the thesis about media as a constitutional component can work in two ways. In one sense, you have, I think, an interesting sort of aspect to the media as a constitutional component because, the media as a fourth estate has really sort of become integrated into political life, and it has an institutional inertia. It's resistant to change. it's very integrated into the ways of political life. So, you have the reliance of journalists on particular sources from particular political players. You have junior journalists essentially reproducing press releases. And that, I think, has created a lot of criticism. But of course, what that does is that opens up sites for citizen journalism and makes this even more sort of urgent. And so one of the things that we've also seen in Australian political life, which is why I think the issue of citizen journalism is even more urgent, is that citizen journalism has been really important in breaking some stories that are politically important, that are important in public interest terms in Australia. But it still exists in a sort of very strange space. So there's a sort of sniffiness about this in the media and political class in Australia. So we've had major sort of stories involving, our current Deputy Prime Minister 3 years ago during the last election campaign, conservative, rural conservative, person who campaigned very heavily against gay marriage being legalised. He was having an affair with one of his staffers, impregnated her. She was pregnant with his child during that election campaign. You had an online, blogger, document this story and disseminate that during the election campaign. The mainstream media didn't report that story at all. 3 months after the election campaign, a tabloid newspaper published a photograph of this woman now pregnant, now married to the Deputy Prime Minister, and won a Walkley Award for it. And it was as if the blogger had never sort of reported that. But of course, in the online space, that sort of story, that sort of criticism of mainstream journalism, mainstream media journalism, and the criticism that mainstream media journalism is so integrated and dependent upon access to power, became a real sort of side of criticism. So I think this idea of the media as a constitutional component is, incredibly sort of stimulating when you sort of map that onto media landscapes around the world. But it operates, I think, in a number of different ways. And of course, for every sort of citizen journalist who breaks a major story like that, you have citizen journalists who do precisely the opposite. So at the moment, we have a citizen journalist who, on one view, might be doing a public service because he sits in courts and blogs about what occurs in courts. But he doesn't care about suppression orders, and he doesn't care about directions as to law, and he doesn't care about when the trial judge sends the jury out. And so he just blogs all kinds of things. So he runs a blog called the Kangaroo Court of Australia, which is, rather sort of terrible sort of blog, very useful for teaching contempt of court, not very useful for sort of the standards of court reporting. And he's currently sort of escaping arrest because he's been wanted for being jailed for contempt of court. So what I think is really sort of interesting about this idea, when you sort of map this onto media practice, is that it operates or has the potential to operate in different ways. And certainly the role of citizen journalists, I think, becomes increasingly important. And you do see that, I think, in relation to contempt of court. What I think is really interesting about contempt of court is when we look at this, and I think this is a sort of, fairly universal sort of thing, and Pete sort of, I think, talks about this very usefully. You have this sort of discourse in the decided cases about the importance of open justice, the idea that the media, the institutional media, acts as a conduit for information, the eyes and ears of the public. And that all sounds very noble. And I think we have some sort of sense that that occurred in the past, and perhaps it did. But that was always a very resource-intensive exercise, both in terms of, the amount of time that's involved, the number of bodies that are involved, And what I think is really interesting about this is that there's a real problem, I think, for institutional media to continue to perform that function of holding judges accountable, providing information to the public about what goes on in courts, simply because even large media companies no longer have sufficient bodies on the ground to actually send journalists to cover, all the cases that are going on. So there's a leading journalism academic in Australia called Margaret Simons, who for many years was a jobbing journalist in Melbourne. And she talks about when she joined the Melbourne Herald back in the 1970s, I think it was, that of the cadets, there were 3 of them who were sent round to be sort of dedicated court reporters. And she talks about the cohort of cadets that was taken in the year in which she was taken on. Major national newspapers in Australia now take on 5 cadets a year. So the idea that you would have 3 cadets devoted to reporting courts in one city is just surreal. And of course, this is a sort of huge problem. I mean, even today in Sydney alone, we have 2 major defamation trials, we have 2 major murder trials. And so for a media organisation to have people sitting in that court is a huge investment of time. And of course, they'll only be able to file 1 report for the day. They won't be able to file 2 or 3 stories. And of course, to do that coverage properly, they'll have to do it there day after day. And of course, that then gives rise to the prospect of and the possibility of citizen journalism. And one of the things that we're seeing in Australia is that there are more dedicated people going into court and reporting, usually using Twitter. That creates some interesting problems in and of itself, just in terms of, regulating that, because every jurisdiction is different. Some courts here will require permission. There's legislation or regulation in some jurisdictions here which say that if you are a journalist, you can do it. Some jurisdictions define what a journalist is, some don't. One of the things that I was really attracted to in the book is this sort of focus more on the functional, which I think is really important, sort of the function of who is a journalist, what you are doing, rather than who you are sort of professionally. And that, I think, has a real resonance in Australia in terms of the legislation or the regulation of journalistic activity, not only in relation to the use of social media in court, but also in relation to the protection of journalist sources. So one of the problems with the Federation is that you have so many different pieces of statute that occasionally you want to have uniform approaches to these things, and you want to have national coordinate legislation. So we've tried that in relation to protecting journalist sources, but of course every parliament has to go and legislate their own version, and so minor changes can be made. And one of the fascinating divergences in relation to the protection of journalist sources is that the Commonwealth legislation that applies in federal courts in Australia talks about people who are engaged in the practice of journalism, who are pursuing journalism. Whereas in New South Wales, the same legislation says that you have to be engaged in the professional occupation of journalism. And so it's very much the sort of professional occupational identity, which I think is really different and much more limiting, designed to exclude citizen bloggers. And in fact, that was really a design in New South Wales. There was a sort of suggestion at the time when that legislation was passed, whether you should allow people who were not accredited journalists from mainstream media organisations, whether they should be excluded. So it's not only in the way in which, courts approach this, but also I think the design of legislation, which raises these sorts of issues. The defamation part, I think, is also very interesting. The most obvious sort of site for this, I think, is the public interest defences to defamation. That really, I think, seems to me to be the sort of site or the aspect of defamation law which really raises questions about to what extent do you sort of recognise these sorts of standards of journalism, and how sort of, widely do you sort of apply them? And I think that's a very sort of problematic, the history of Reynolds and then its adoption in different forms in Canada and then New Zealand and most recently in Australia, I think really demonstrates how difficult some of these questions are, firstly in courts sort of developing them, then of course in legislature embodying those in legislation, but also just in terms of applying them. You often have judges at first instance, and this is, I think, particularly in Australia, but there were experiences in English courts where you have judges who are really hostile to, or in their disposition averse to, providing broad-based protection even for recognised journalists when they're engaging in public interest journalism. So the idea that you could then extend that beyond people who were accredited journalists, even when they're sort of operating in what one might think of as the quality or broadsheet end of journalism. If you take that sort of view when you're dealing with, if you take a very restrictive view to public interest journalism, when you're dealing with those types of publications, then broadening that out to citizen journalists, I think, becomes really problematic. So I think citizen journalism and, the idea of thinking about the media as a constitutional component and applying or extending that, I think, is a really rich and fertile way of thinking about these sorts of problems. I'm not sure where I sort of ultimately land with all of these, so I think I probably have more questions than answers. Which I think is always a sign of a very excellent book, that it stimulates your thinking and it makes you think about the way in which you've thought about things before. So I congratulate you. Any book is an achievement, but this one is particularly an achievement.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. So last but definitely by no means least, I'm going to hand over to Lexi.
Thanks, Pete. I think I've been invited to add to the diversity of Antipodean regions Pete's colleagues and peers emanate from. Yes, my name's Lexi. I'm the Head of Regulation of Impress, which is the UK's only Royal Charter approved and recognised regulator of the press in the UK. And I've enjoyed many conversations with Pete over the years. I think we met probably 3.5 years ago. And Pete is now a member of our code committee alongside Paul Ragg, and we have enjoyed his valuable contributions to our work. And I was very pleased to get an offer to read the book and participate in the panel today. And I'm very pleased to see, first of all, in my observations of the book, that Pete's included that separation that other speakers have talked about of the functional versus institutional definition of media, because that has been a consideration for myself and my own work for a long time. And the fact that it's been put to paper with really robust and sound legal philosophical underpinning is in what is a sort of excellent digest and overview of the issues that we face as a press regulator, not just for us practitioners or for academics, but also for the average reader. I think it's really important, because I think we've started to see, or we're in the midst of seeing, the sort of worst excesses of the abuse of the term press freedom. And there's a general lack of public, academic, and even political, dare I say it, understanding of how and why media freedom exists and how it's supposed to operate, particularly online, and a real dearth and understanding of the co-committed responsibilities that are accorded to press freedom or media freedom and why it exists. And Pete's book sets this out very clearly. He explains how this relationship between these elevated rights and corresponding responsibilities is symbiotic, and how you can't have one without the other, as much as some operating in the media sphere would like to. And I think we've seen in the UK anyway, in recent media policy history, where the UK government, but other governments world over, and more in social media platforms online, and to some extent the courts even here in the UK have started to accrue more rights for the institutional press and further eroded the corresponding responsibilities that we would expect from having those elevated rights. And this has distorted that relationship. And what we're also seeing in the civil society space is this growing movement advocating that the media should not enjoy any rights beyond the basic individual rights experienced under the freedom of expression wherever they live in articles, etc., because of how far we've strayed from a sound legal basis for media freedom. And I think the best example of this really is in the government's proposed legislation here in the UK on the Online Safety Bill, where news media will yet again be privileged above individual speakers and platforms themselves by being not only exempted from statutory duties set out in that bill, but also by having a right to carry on platforms that non-media users and individuals will not enjoy. Now, that right, that new media right in law, will not have to carry any sort of responsibility with it, such as acting in the public interest. And the definition of news media in that bill is very institutionally based rather than functionally based. And so I think Pete's work serves as a gentle reminder of returning to the theory when discussing who should be the beneficiaries of media freedom and when and how we should extend rights to the media and to citizen journalists in particular. So reading the book, I would wholeheartedly endorse the new MAC theory proposed by Pete, and it did leave me thinking as I was reading it. Well, what do we do with the institutional media that may have derogated from the MAC theory to the extent that they no longer meet the premise of the theory? Should they not enjoy the benefits conferred by an enhanced media freedom right in law? Because I think there's plenty of examples out there where news gathering and content published is unlikely to meet even one component, the four component parts of the MAC theory, such as a public interest function, and where instead the purveyors have enjoyed rather a sort of long-standing legacy of public custom and reputation, and are able to self-identify as journalists by virtue of that legacy or custom. And examples sort of on a good faith basis, apart from the examples raised by other panelists, might be publications, for example, that only engage in advertorial, that serve sort of no public interest function, or publishers, media outlets, journalists that continually break the law and continually breach civil rights. In the UK, our courts intermittently assess whether institutional media act in the public interest, and only when a claim is brought and only on that fact-specific basis. So we seldom see declarations that a particular media outlet is not acting journalistically, although it's implied, but rather that their conduct sort of isn't defensible in the public interest. So outside of a court finding to that effect, and as Andreas has suggested, that could lead to further state regulation. The question that I sort of have is how do we define this enduring commitment to the MAC, to MAC theory? And the solution proposed by Pete is through regulation or adoption of ethical standards. But bringing it back to the reality and the experience of being a regulator in this space, we know that in the UK, many media outlets would not volunteer to join a regulator. On our numbers, we estimate around 70% of the news market sits outside of regulation here in the UK. So philosophically, they may fail the presumptive tests set out in the MAC theory, and thereby should not enjoy the media freedom privileges that are extended, or should not be beneficiaries of that media freedom. So my question is regulation the only pathway to becoming a beneficiary of the media freedom privileges? If there are not, where does that leave us? Where does that leave the institutional media in the UK? And is this the only, but is this the responsibility of practitioners in the space to connect the theory to the reality? Other questions I raised, and I know Pete sort of in his conclusion decides not to go there in the book, but which I think is an interesting extension, and perhaps Andreas's book acts as a complement to this, an extension of it, are the issues of social media platforms and aggregators being the vectors of news now, and how that sits within the MAC construction, because we know with format convergence and applianceization theory that the average reader of news in the UK and in Europe and beyond is getting their news sourced from a very small number of usually applications on their mobile device. And what that implication is for a media freedom theory, when we know that there are now frictions built into the linear delivery of speaker to audience, or gatekeepers, as Andreas has expressed. And I think there's an implicit assumption in older models of legal theory about media freedom that speech reaches an audience directly from the speaker, whether that's sort of soapbox to audience member or printed paper to eyeball. And what's alluded to in the book is that online news can be really easily alienated from its source. And Pete touches on this when he talks about recycled headlines and the interoperability between institutional media and citizen media. But we see that in all sorts of forms, whether it's sort of edited videos that came from on-the-ground sources that go viral online. But more and more, what we know that occurs online, thanks to various revelations about the internal operation of social media platforms, a lot of the content we see is not only edited, it's algorithmically determined, it's moderated before it even reaches the audience member. And I think that raises a lot of challenging questions for us to consider in terms of, one who's responsible from a legal liability perspective, from a regulatory perspective, what we do about this, but also how media freedom should be enjoyed when there are numerous gatekeepers and frictions and interventions along that speech pipeline. So I hope to see that explored more in Pete's future work as well. And obviously, as a regulator, I should probably speak to our experiences of regulation and how that dovetails with the proposition in Pete's book as well about the future regulation of citizen journalists. We can attest at IMPRESS to operating a voluntary scheme which works in the public interest, but without the conferred legislative incentives that Pete describes. So Pete draws on the European models that proposed by the New Zealand Law Commission and sets up that there needs to be this co-regulatory model of hard legislative incentives to drive citizen journalists into regulation. But IMPRESS, we know that without those conferred legislative incentives, there needs to be other soft power incentives as well. And we've had over 115 outlets in the UK join us, responsible for 200 plus publications, and a lot of them are sole trader, owner-operator journalists working in their community to deliver public interest journalism. And our success as regulating that membership base by providing public redress, by conducting proactive investigations and providing training advice is a testament to the way that regulation can enhance members' media freedom and provide them access to those privileges conferred under media freedom. But also, in the event of a failure of a hard legislative incentive, what can be done to drive membership into self-regulatory bodies. And what I think, where I think as an addendum to Pete's exploration of this in the final chapter of his book is what sort of soft power incentives there can be to drive members into regulation outside of the traditional legal and political structures. And I think that's a really interesting area to plumb. And I would always argue for a citizen journalist regime or a general media regime to be in effect. There needs to be sort of endorsement by other actors in that media exchange. So whether or not that's the judiciary endorsing citizen journalism in cases, or gatekeepers of access to privileged media spaces endorsing citizen journalism as well. You also have advertisers and funders that could encourage or require citizen journalists to adopt a a sort of self-regulatory or regulatory model. And finally, consumers themselves, readers, the public, they need to demand it from their sources of journalism that they adopt these methods in order to enjoy media freedom beyond individual rights to expression as well. So I think there's a lot more that Pete could explore potentially in Media Freedom in the Age of Citizen Journalism 2.0 about the different ways regulation can support the map model that he describes. And there's lots of sort of interesting, outstanding issues to deal with, such as how you deal with the effectiveness of a regulator, being very clear about what its powers and remedies are, its scope and remit, whether it should be a monitoring body or an appellate body, how it assesses adherence of citizen journalism, because he highlights there's some really unique idiosyncrasies to citizen journalists that institutional media don't carry, such as how often they should publish or issues of training, etc. But overall, I thought it was an excellent starting point, and I'll end my sort of observations there. But just to say, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. For a book dense in legal philosophy, I'd call it a page turner. So congratulations, Pete, for an excellent synthesis and analysis. And I highly recommend, and have begun recommending, the book as a seminal text on media freedom theory and practice for citizen journalists in the media more generally. So well done.
Thank you so much, Lexi. I really appreciate it. Nobody's described it as a page turner yet. Not even Hayley, my wife Hayley. So I really appreciate that. That's lovely of you to say. So thank you, and thank you to all of you who've given your views. As a panel, you've been wonderful. So thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be questions. What I thought I would do though is just respond to a few of the observations that were made broadly, I think, and then I'll hand over to the audience to see if they have any questions for any of us. I think the first observation to make really is that for me, and actually David mentioned this, the book created more questions and answers. It has for me as well. In fact, just listening to you all now, I've now got more questions than I have answers. And in fact, in the book, I say that really this book lays the foundation for further research. I don't for a second think that what I propose in the book has all the answers at all. I don't think it does. I think in some situations it probably, as David said, does create more questions. I am planning a sequel, but I haven't told Hayley that yet. I think she may divorce me if she finds out. But I do have ideas for kind of building on some of the things that I put forward in this book, because and I actually have to say, since the book was published, even since the book was published, even since December, things have moved on, things have changed, which again may well alter some of the ideas that I've put forward. But I think one of the things I wanted to mention really, and it struck me actually in the last couple of days, the work that I've been doing on SLAPs with the Ministry of Justice, and also when I was called to give evidence yesterday to Justice Select Committee, is really the fact that citizen journalists still aren't getting the recognition that they deserve for the role that they are playing in public discourse. And that was quite evident yesterday, I think, when we were talking about SLAPs and who are affected by SLAPs. And still the view is it's journalists predominantly, but journalists working for bigger media organisations, journalists working for your institutional newspapers. It's not, citizen journalists aren't getting the recognition that they are really quite badly affected, or can be badly affected by SLAPs. They don't have the same sort of resources and the same sort of protection, and they don't have the same people that they can go to get help than perhaps the bigger institutional, or the institutional members of the press. And that really is where, for instance, the regulatory scheme that I suggest that I set out in the final chapter can come in, because as Lexi said, one of the things it talks about there is the incentives around regulation. How do we make regulation more attractive when it's voluntary? Well, it's to give regulated members added benefits. It could be access to legal advice. It could be access to the support they may need if they are threatened with some sort of legal action, whether it be a slap or not. So it's things like that where I think being recognised as media and being able to be regulated is really, really very important. And one of the other things I talk about in the book, actually, which wasn't picked up on the observations, and I probably should have mentioned it at the start, and I didn't, is that, and I talk about this in more detail in the final chapter, is that citizen journalists, there's lots of citizen journalists out there who don't actually know they're citizen journalists because they don't, they've never had formal journalistic training, they've never worked for a newspaper, for instance. They're blogging away, doing great work, but perhaps they don't realise that what they're actually doing is journalism. And they don't realise, therefore, that there are certain responsibilities attached to that, but there are also potentially benefits attached to that too. So that's one of the things that I want this book to help with, I guess. The other thing I was going to pick up on, and again, I mention it in the book, is that, yes, citizen journalists, I think on the whole, doing great work. I think our journalists, institutional journalists on the whole, do great work. Of course, there are exceptions to that. And what I make clear in the book is that, yes, although, citizen journalists are on the whole making positive contributions to public discourse, there are citizen journalists out there who are wholly irresponsible. They are potentially damaging reputations, invading privacy, breaching data protection in the same way that an institutional journalist can do. So again, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to try and find a way of recognising, who is a citizen journalist, and therefore we can then ask the next question. Well, okay, we've recognised them. How can we then maybe look at regulating them or attracting them to regulation? The problem is, of course, is that this recognition of who, and this is something Rebecca picked up on, recognition of who is a journalist is still incredibly problematic. We know this, and it goes to the point I made earlier about the fact that they're not getting the recognition they deserve. And in fact, this came out in the evidence that was submitted to the government's consultation on the online safety bill. One of the things that some of the social media companies said in the evidence they gave is that we really struggle to recognise who is a journalist. When does an individual blogger become a journalist? And therefore, what does that mean for us in respect of our duties under what will be the Online Safety Act, once it's brought into force? So again, I'm hoping that some of the ideas I have in this book could potentially help with that. But again, I know it's not necessarily going to be not necessarily going to answer all of the questions. And I think the other main point I wanted to pick up on is, again, in the book, I recognise that some of the things I say are controversial. What I wanted to do was create principles, some guiding principles and I realise not all of them are going to be adopted, not all of them are going to be agreed with, but I hope guiding principles that will start to answer some of the questions that we have around who is a journalist, what is the media, and how do we go about protecting the public? How do we go about protecting journalists and enabling them to go about and do their job in a way that will benefit the public? And that is what I hope I've achieved in the book. Although, like I say, I appreciate I may well, in some cases, have created more questions than answers. But look, I'm going to stop rambling on because I know we may well have questions from the audience, and you've heard from me a lot. So, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? I think we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So just let me have a look at those. But if anybody wants to speak, by all means, you can do. So I'm just looking at the questions in the chat at the moment. So one of the questions we've got, there's two questions so far. So I'll just read the first one. The whole COVID reporting situation is a once-in-a-lifetime perspective. Who decides what the media's responsibilities are? Is it Rupert Murdoch or Bill Gates, for instance? Who decides misinformation and what to censor? I completely respect alternative media during the pandemic. Unheard, Rebel News, Russell Brand, Rogan, etc. They're a breath of fresh air contrasted to the heavily conflicted media who are only interested in political point scoring and financial gain. I mean, I'm happy to say something about this, but does anybody else want to chip in at all from the panel? First of all, no, No, that's absolutely fine. I quite happily take the question. So, I think it's an excellent question, and I think when we look at the responsibilities of the media, as I say in the book, I think there's clear kind of, in my view, jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, which talks about the obligations and responsibilities that the press has. But of course, where you through regulation and through the standards that regulators set, and they are minimum standards for the profession. So, if you are a journalist and you are regulated by us, whoever that may be, then you will abide by these minimum standards, these minimum kind of responsibilities. And that's the least you should be doing. Okay. And that's essentially where we would get them from. Of course, some media organizations quite rightly may say, well, the regulator sets a minimum standard, but actually we're going to abide by a higher standard, and that's absolutely fine. They can set those standards. And in fact, as a professional, you would hope that they would do that. And of course, as a professional, you would hope that they'd also be setting their own standards as well. The problem is whether or not they do that, and actually whether or not they can do it in the current climate. And this is something I talk about in the book, that particularly the institutional press are under so much pressure because of job losses, because of the way that news is now generated and consumed. We have 24-hour rolling news. There are less journalists to do the work. There is more space and time to fill. Means that those pressures ultimately, whether they mean to or not, may lead to mistakes being made. It may lead to cost cutting, and it's that kind of it's the institutional structure, the corporate pressures that have imposed that on journalists. It's not all necessarily always their fault. And also Lexi touched on something that I talk about a lot in the book, and which I find really, really interesting. And it was in the first two chapters I talk about the way that we generate and consume news. And one of the big issues we've had, and I know I've had lots of discussions with Lexi in respect of Impress about this, is that people these days, they may well think that they're getting their news from lots of different sources, but very often it's coming from one news aggregator. It could be coming from Apple or Google or Facebook. The problem is that as an audience, we don't always know that. We may think, well, actually, we're getting a really wide variety of news here, from all these different sources. It's great, but actually it's not. And very often, what happens is it's coming from an aggregator, and those sources of news and those news stories have been algorithmically filtered by that news aggregator. So we're seeing essentially what Facebook or Google or Apple want us to see. So I think there's another added layer of responsibility, and I don't really know the answer to this, is, how do we try to how do we educate the audience so that they know that? It's fine if you know that, it's fine if you're aware of that, but so many of us aren't aware of that. And I think that is also a problem, which maybe I'll talk about in the sequel to the book. Who knows? And then the second question we've got is, what does the media theory advanced in Peter's book say about users' comments? Should the online press assume greater responsibility than it does already, or is the notice and takedown scheme satisfactory? Well, I'll be honest with you, it doesn't say anything about user comments. I didn't get onto that, but it's maybe something I should look at again. Sequel, just don't tell my wife. Does anybody want to talk about user comments at all? Does anybody else on the panel want to say anything about that? Perhaps got more to say, Paul?
Yes. Sorry, I was. This is a problem in the context of the online safety bill. Sorry, I nearly call it the online harms bill, but it's subsequently been changed. Because there's still this grey area. At least I think there's still a grey area, and Lexi will know more than me about this because Lexi's on it. But I think this is covered by the exemption, isn't it, Lexi? Just shake your head or nod if yeah. So this won't be regulatable through the online safety bill, which creates this really weird problem. Lacuna was the word I was scrabbling for there. In that you could say something on Twitter which could attract liability, but you could write something in the Sun comments section and it wouldn't attract liability, which just seems odd to me. The other, of course, the other thing about user-generated comments is that Ipso has a weird position on user-generated comments. It's sort of, and this is what I was sort of scrabbling to find. It says that it will take into account comments about reader comments, and I will copy the link into the chat so that you can see this. Sorry, I can't multitask. So it says it will take into account these comments and regulate them, but it doesn't, so far as I can tell. So that seems to be the only recourse that an individual could have about. Well, actually, no, that's not right. That's not the only recourse that an individual could have. Of course, it's not. But that might be one of the ways in which an individual could complain about those by going through the regulator. Sorry, that's a really brambly, rubbish answer. Wasn't worth me interjecting for that.
No, it's not at all, Paul. Thank you very much. Thank you. Does anybody else want to add anything to that? I mean, actually, there's another question which kind of follows on from what's just been asked and said, which without wanting to put you on the spot, Lexi, you may want to answer or be able to answer. So the question is, am I right in thinking from what's been said today that under the new online safety legislation, serious commentators who don't have a press card will be subject to new restrictions that the journalist with a card won't be subject to?
Yes, so I'll just tail off Paul's comment there about under the line comments, which I hope really helpful, and then move into that question, which is that yes, news websites that have comment functioning will not be subject to any new safety duties, and they're not subject to any other legal requirement short of the exception in the Defamation Act about notice and takedown. At Impress, we require that if the publisher is notified of a comment on an article, they must deal with it under the standards code, subject to Impress sanctions if they don't deal with it adequately in compliance with our regulatory scheme. But that is our standard and not a standard universally held across the sector. So with respect to how that intersects with online safety, what's going to happen is platforms and their users are going to be subject to a range of new statutory duties. The government has not yet listed all of the priority harms, but it ranges from child abuse to terrorist content all the way down to harassment and abuse. And so you as an individual user on a platform will be subject to the terms and conditions that platform sets out in relation to their duties. So you are going to be subject to further limitations on your speech and expression that you have not that you've enjoyed to date, that you are likely to not enjoy in future. However, if you are a news publisher, as defined under the Act, you are not going to be subject to those same duties, and your content that you publish on social media will have an automatic right of or presumption of what we're calling this right to carry, of remaining on the site, and only subject to appeal with the platform will it be removed. So that's what I talk about when I talk about this new privilege, this new benefit conferred on those news publishers on social media that your everyday average user won't have. And on the issue of press cards in particular, the definition of news publisher in the Act doesn't set out a press card as a requirement for enjoying that benefit. all it says is you must be registered in the UK, you must have a standards code and a complaints policy. So there's no other professional barrier to entry to being a news publisher on the site, save for this very low threshold definition of what amounts to a news publisher. So no, press cards won't be the defining factor in whether or not you're a news publisher. It's going to be this other definition, which doesn't relate to sort of professional ethics or responsibilities either.
Thank you, Lexi. That was great, and Paul as well. Thanks for your answer. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has any other questions at all. I don't know if there's any questions from the panel. No. I don't know if there are any other questions from the audience. Just going to give it a few seconds just to see if there are any more. I think it looks like that's probably it. Well, look, that concludes this book launch, this panel session. Thank you so much to all of you for taking part in this. I am so grateful, and I'm also so grateful for your very, very kind words about my book. I, honestly, to all of you guys in the audience, I haven't paid them. They said this voluntarily. They are here voluntarily. But no, thank you all so much. I really am so grateful. It does all still feel very surreal to me. So I'm really grateful to all of you, and I'm very grateful to everyone that's attended this session as well. Like I said at the start, I still can't quite believe that people are interested in what I have to say, and also that you may read my book. And if any of you want to get in touch with me and ask any further questions, by all means, please do so. I'm always very happy to talk about my work, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions offline as well. So that's it. So thank you all very, very much. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and David, I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
and just thank you all very, very much again for being part of this. I'm really very grateful.